Most of the LINCWorks curriculum materials have been created at both a CLB3 and CLB5 level. However, there are plenty of ways that instructors who teach other CLB levels or multi-level classes can use and adapt the materials to work in their context. In this screencast, we will take a look at how to best use and modify the LINCWorks material for use in multi-level classrooms. The first thing to note is that most of the LINCWorks modules contain parallel activities in the CLB3 and CLB5 versions. For example, let's take a look at the module summary table for the CLB3 and CLB5 versions of the Job Basics 1 module. This table can be found in the Overview section of the Module Activities and Lessons document. The document on the left side of the screen is the CLB3 version, and the document on the right side of the screen is the CLB5 version. Here we can see that the modules follow the same pattern, covering the same topics until the end of the CLB5 module, which has a few extra lessons on initiative and the probationary period. If a multi-level class had both CLB3 and CLB5 learners, this module would be quite easy to use, as most of the time the CLB3 learners would be doing a simplified version of what the CLB5s are doing. It is important to note that even though the lessons may follow the same themes, at times the handouts and structure of the lessons may vary. For example, we see here that in Lesson 1 of the CLB3 and CLB5 Job Basics 1 module, there is only one handout, which has the same title, Handout Job Basics Intro. However, if we look at Lesson 2, we can see that the list of handouts is quite different, which means that the lessons themselves will also be quite different. To give you an idea of what the parallel versions of the LINCWorks materials look like, let's take a look at those handouts from Lesson 1. The handout on the left side of my screen is the CLB3 version, and the handout on the right side of my screen is the CLB5 version. What you should notice right away is the background information section and instructions are simpler in the CLB3 version of the handout. The same is true for the text we see down below. The CLB3 version of the text contains less compound sentences as well as simpler vocabulary. You can also see that the CLB5 version asks the learners to come up with their own title for the text, which is a task that is not asked of the CLB3 learners. Looking at the questions down below, we can see that the CLB3 and the CLB5 versions are quite different. The CLB5 questions ask for more information and are more complex than the CLB3 questions. Instructors teaching multi-level classes would have an easy time using these materials, as the task and instructions are almost exactly the same and could be given out and facilitated in the same way for both CLB3 and CLB5 learners. Multi-level instructors may only want to use the materials that exist in both the CLB3 and CLB5 versions, because this would make planning quite easy. However, the materials in the LINCWorks modules can all be downloaded as Microsoft Word files. This means that the materials can be modified by instructors as needed. Modifying the LINCWorks materials for higher and lower level learners is a strategy that instructors who teach multi-level classes may need to use in order to teach the materials well. There are several ways that the materials can be modified to work well in a multi-level classroom. The first of these is varying the language complexity. As we saw before, the language complexity in the CLB3 and CLB5 reading tasks are varied to make them level appropriate. The same is true of the listening materials. However, instructors can choose to modify them even more to make them simpler for lower CLB levels or more complex for higher CLB levels. Let's look at an example of how an instructor might do this, using another task from the Job Basics 1 module. This is the CLB3 version of an activity about reading work schedules. Here, the learners are asked to read the schedule and answer the questions on the following pages. One way that an instructor could change the language complexity for a lower level learner would be to reduce the amount of text on this schedule. For example, I might take out the bottom 2 rows of the schedule. Then, I would need to modify the questions so they only asked for basic details about these 2 rows. On the other hand, if I wanted to increase the complexity of the schedule for a CLB4 learner, I might add 2 rows to the schedule and make the cells smaller, making the table more difficult to read. The second way I could modify the LINCworks materials for a multi-level class would be to vary the amount of scaffolding in the lessons. This means that I could either add extra activities to give lower level learners more practice with the skills, or remove some of the activities to give the higher level learners less support. Let's look at Lesson 2 from the Job Basics 1 module for an example of this. Here we can see that many of the steps in the lesson are paralleled. They both start with a warm-up activity, then suggest a grammar lesson on imperatives, and then have a video about work instructions after that. Here's where the lesson plans diverge. While the CLB5 learners go straight into a dictation activity, the CLB3 learners instead will watch a PowerPoint about the steps of following directions and have a practice activity where they listen to one-step instructions before getting to the dictation activity that the CLB5 learners are doing. We can also see an example of varying the language complexity in the dictation task, as the CLB3 learners will listen to 4-step instructions, while the CLB5s will listen to 8-step instructions. Instructors can modify the LINCworks lessons and materials in the same way. If an instructor has CLB2 learners in their class, they may want to add a few more practices with the 1-step instructions before moving on to a shorter, possibly 2 to 3-step dictation. In the same way, steps of the CLB5 lesson plan can be removed for CLB6 or 7 learners in the class to give them more of a challenge when completing the practice with the dictation. The third way instructors can adapt the LINCworks materials for multi-level classes would be to vary the task complexity for higher and lower level learners. Let's look at one of the activities from Lesson 2 to get an example of this. This is an activity where learners listen to instructions about how to make coffee at work. First of all, if we look at the transcripts for the CLB3 and CLB5 versions of this activity, we can see that the CLB3 listening text is much shorter and simpler than the CLB5 version. Then, if we look at the questions, we can see that learners are asked to do some of the same things. For example, both of the levels need to put the steps of the instructions into the correct order. However, the CLB3 version has more scaffolding, as the learners are given pictures of the steps to support them. Finally, we can see that the CLB5 version has a lot more questions, and that the questions are more complex. If we go back to the transcript, we can see that the CLB5 learners are given an extra step in their instructions to get into a group to decide who will make the coffee each day. This added step makes the CLB5 task more complex than the CLB3 task. These activities could also be modified for lower and higher level learners. For example, in the CLB3 activity, the learners need to listen for keywords and write them in the blank spaces. A way to adapt this for a lower level learner might be to write 2 word choices into those spaces and have them circle the correct word. A way to make the CLB5 task more complex might be to ask a more difficult situational question, such as, should you politely interrupt your boss if you don't understand something she says? Explain your answer. Adding a question like this would be an easy way to make a task more complex for a higher level learner while having them listen to the same recording as the lower level learners. Finally, instructors can vary the amount of communicative stress in order to adapt the LINCWorks materials for multi-level classes. Varying the communicative stress means changing the situation that learners are communicating in to make the task more or less difficult. What makes this strategy great is that it doesn't require instructors to spend a lot of time changing the materials themselves. Instructors only need to change the situation that learners are communicating in, making this a very efficient way to modify materials for multi-level classes. For example, these 2 tasks from the module Job Basics 1 both have the learners practice apologizing to a manager for being late to work. However, the CLB3 task has the learners practice this in a face-to-face situation, while the CLB5 learners are expected to complete the interaction over the phone or while sitting back-to-back. This change adds extra stress to the CLB5 communication because they don't have the added help of seeing the other speaker's face and body language. The CLB3 task could be made less stressful by making sure that the listener is extra supportive. This means that the listener could help the learner by asking guiding questions and giving them prompts, such as, "Why were you late today?" The CLB5 task could be made more stressful by having the learners speak to a more senior employee on the phone instead of just their manager. Making this change would make the communication more formal and therefore more stressful. Both of these modifications can be made with little changes to the actual materials and to the facilitation of the activities, but they force instructors to change the expectations of what the learners can do with the materials. All of these activities, with their modifications, could be facilitated in one classroom at the same time. It is important to note that not all of the LINCWorks modules follow parallel topics as well as the module we used as an example today. Let's look at the resume module as an example of this. The resume and cover letter modules have some of the same lessons included in them, but they differ at many points as well. With modules like this, instructors can choose to either only cover the material that exists in both the CLB3 and CLB5 version, or they can choose one module to follow and modify the materials they wish to use for the different levels in their class. One more important thing to note before we conclude is that the supporting materials also primarily exist in parallel CLB3 and CLB5 versions. The only time this is not the case is when grammar or strategies are too complex for CLB3 and thus can only be taught at a CLB5 level. For example, we see the grammar folder has more CLB5 topics than CLB3 topics because some of the CLB5 topics are too challenging for CLB3 learners. The supporting materials are modifiable, just like the activities in the main modules, so instructors can adapt them for lower and higher level learners. In review, the LINCWorks materials can be used effectively in a multi-level classroom for these reasons. The materials are at 2 CLB levels, 3 and 5, that largely parallel each other. The materials can be downloaded as Microsoft Word files and can be modified for learners at different levels by varying the complexity of the language, varying the amount of scaffolding used, varying the complexity of the tasks, and varying the amount of communicative stress. This screencast was funded through a grant from Alberta Advanced Education. The LINCWorks resources were funded by the Employment and Social Development Canada Office of Literacy and Essential Skills.